5,
4,
3,
2,
1,
go. Hello and welcome to Space Now, the space news podcast from the National Space Centre that goes beyond the headlines. I'm space presenter Zoe Baily.
And I'm space expert Dhara Patel.
Coming up today, Katy Perry went to space. We are going to have a good talk about that in our first section. And then following that, what is a space tourist? Are they an astronaut or not? We're going to cover that debate later on in the episode.
So Zoe, it's great to have you on the podcast. We've had a few episodes already and we've had a range of space experts and presenters. And we've kind of told a little bit about ourselves, but tell us a little bit about what you do here at the Space Centre and what you're looking forward to in this podcast.
So I am part of the Discovery team and the part of the team that looks after the public. So if you come visit the Space Centre with your family or friends, you're very likely to see me on my team. We're going to be hopefully teaching you some exciting stuff about space. For this podcast, I'm very excited to, chat about various space topics, as I love to do. But I'm also really excited to help equip our viewers with that sort of the facts, the knowledge, kind of demystify things in the hopes that these really kind of tricky topics that are quite complex really helps people have that knowledge to make up their own mind and their own opinions on these sorts of things.
Yeah, it's really nice. And the hope is, I guess, that families are at home sitting and talking about the things that we talk about here too.
Yeah, absolutely. So for our first segment, we have Space Wows, big and small recent news stories in space. Have you got a Space Wow for us today?
Yeah, there's a few things that I was looking at, but trawling through some of the websites, I actually came across a little video that looked like a disco ball floating away from the ISS, and I was immediately like, what is going on here? And the headline read something like, first ever on-orbit plume impingement. And I was suckered in. I was like, okay, what on earth is this? So this image or this little video clip was actually of a Dragon capsule, so the SpaceX capsule that is used to transport crew and cargo up and down from the International Space Station. And it was basically moving away from the International Space Station, caught on camera, and it was basically blasting out these little plumes. Essentially thrusters that were firing to get it moving away from the ISS. And for the first time ever, it's actually been recorded on camera because the angle was just right that sunlight was actually reflecting off of those particles, allowing us to be able to see it. But what I found really cool from this is just this idea of the danger of these impingements. So the idea is that it's obviously blasting off or jettisoning off this gas, allowing it to move in the opposite direction, moving it away from the ISS. But actually, because space is a vacuum, that gas that's expelled is literally just flowing out with nothing to impede it. And when it's really close to the International Space Station, it's actually firing off the International Space Station. And on this video, it actually captured that. And it's really dangerous when we think about the International Space Station is in a precise orbit, or at least it's tried to be kept in that orbit. And here we've got something firing at it, kind of taking it off that orbit. It can also cause things like contamination and damage. And it really went to show for me, at least when we're thinking about space exploration, it's these little things that we also need to think about. So really cool video. Check it out if you haven't seen it, but also a very new term to get used to, on-orbit plume impingement.
Yeah, always a bit complicated with space terms.
Yeah, always is. And what about you? What have you seen in the news that has made you go, wow?
So I was actually having a little read of some research, some science that's been being done recently. It was from just the end of last year, and it was actually some biology experiments that took place on the International Space Station.
And that's your background, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So special interest for me there. They were looking at growing what are called organoids in space. That sounds a bit complicated, but basically when we want to study different things in the body, we have to use like a model system for it. And a really good, useful way of doing that is getting these special kinds of cells. They're called stem cells. They can kind of change into lots of different cells in our body. Very helpful for research and, of course, for us. And this particular study used these cells to make kind of what are little mini brains, very simplified versions of them.
That sounds quite cool.
Yeah, very cool. They're used quite a lot in research on the Earth. And, they're not perfect, but they're a really good kind of model to use if we're going to kind of look at things, especially like diseases, things like that in humans. This particular experiment made a little mini brain. And they sent these up to the International Space Station. They kind of grew for 30 days, and they actually made it safely back down. really important because it meant that the scientists could go and do a bunch of tests on them.
Okay.
Of course, as with all science, they've got a control on the Earth as well, so they did a lot of comparison. And one of the big things that they found was that these cells that had gone up to the International Space Station had actually matured quicker than the ones on the Earth.
And matured in their development, in their growth?
Yeah, and of cells specifically. So this isn't to do with sort of like aging, but cells themselves, they kind of grow, they change, and they become what they're meant to. This process seemed to have happened quicker in space than it had on the ground.
That's quite exciting.
Yeah, because there's been not many experiments that do this sort of thing in space, and there's lots of potential reasons for why. We don't really know. It's still that area of science where there's lots of hypotheses going around. But potentially it could be that these kind of model systems actually work better in space and might be a better place to test out some of these theories and research things like Alzheimer's and dementia, which is what a lot of these sort of studies try and look at.
It's another application for space, isn't it? The idea that we can build and manufacture things in space, and they might actually be better manufactured in a space environment than they might do on Earth.
Yeah, and I think people always think about, space being about physics and engineering, but there's so many different applications to it that can affect us all the time.
Cool.
So on to our first main topic, which I introduced earlier as Katy Perry went to space, but I'm hoping, as we discussed, we'll see that there is a lot more to it than that. Do you want to give us a little rundown, a little bit of info and background on what we're talking about?
Yeah, I'm sure many people will have at least seen the headline, if not watched the actual flight. So this was what we call a New Shepard flight. So by Blue Origin, a private space company, using their New Shepard rocket. And it was a flight that we call a suborbital flight. So that means that these astronauts aren't going into orbit around the Earth, but they're literally going up, crossing the boundary of space on a bit of a parabola, so going up and then coming back down, all in the space of about 10 to 12 minutes. So it's a really short flight, but they're going across the boundary of space and then coming back. And it's a reusable rocket. So the rocket is automated. There is no piloting control done by any of the passengers on board. And what's really interesting about this flight, and I think it's one of the reasons it made the headlines, is it was an all-female flight.
Yeah, I think that was definitely something a lot of them talked about, was really pushed the fact that it was this full female flight. Who was it that we've got on this flight?
Yeah, so there were 6 of these ladies on board. I can't remember them all off by heart, so I've got them here in front of me. So we've got Lauren Sanchez. She is a journalist, an author, and as portrayed in the media, the wife of Jeff Bezos, who owns the Blue Origin company. Alongside, she had a lady called Aisha Bowe. She is a former NASA rocket scientist, producer of films Kerry Ann Flynn. We had the journalist Gail King on board as well. And then we had Amanda Nguyen, who is an activist, but also a bioastronautics researcher, which I guess floats your boat. And then, of course, the pop star Katy Perry, who made the headlines.
Yes, it did focus around her quite a bit, didn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting in the sense that this is the first time we've had an all-female crew, apart from if we take ourselves back to the early 1960s, where we had the single crewed flight of Valentina Tereshkova, who went up by herself on an orbital flight. And since then, we've never had a completely female crewed flight. There have been multiple females that have been in space. And what's interesting for me is that actually, it's funny that it took a private space flight to create an all-female space flight. This hasn't been done by ESA, the European Space Agency. It hasn't been done by NASA. But I think, unfortunately, the publicity around it kind of detracted from actually some of the things that these women are really good at, or what should have actually been highlighted about their careers and what they've achieved.
Yeah, I think there is so much in terms of what this flight means for different people, what it could mean. I think also a really big question of why was this one so interesting, to get into sort of personal reactions a little bit. I haven't really previously watched these flights. They've not been of a huge excitement to me, but we were both here at the Space Centre the day it happened, and downstairs we streamed it and people were really keen about it. Everyone was talking about it, so it really at the very least, engaged a lot of people. But the discourse around it has been mixed, I would say, to put it lightly.
Yeah, for me, it's a tale of two halves, in the sense that I think the intentions may have been good behind it, and of course, I think there was probably a publicity angle to it. That these ladies were very inspirational in terms of they were going into space. There was a lot of promotion done around it. There are STEM advocates on this flight, people who advocate for science and technology and women entering those professions. But I think there was an awful lot of things that sort of took away and detracted from that. One of the things that I didn't personally enjoy was the customized spacesuits. Now, if you look at any previous New Shepard flight, it's the typical, standard, comfortable flight suit that they would have been wearing. The ones for these ladies were skin tight, kick flare, definitely made to look slimline and sexy. And, some things that I read behind this, this was a conversation that was had. This was something that was planned. And I think there may have been more important things that they could have planned for and shared on the mission, rather than, hey, girls, we look great coming down on the flight.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it had such potential to be a really positive, inspiring story, especially for women. But it wasn't handled amazingly, and I think perhaps the priorities were different. It was really keen to show how cool and great it was and to be a show, and that wasn't the bit I was super interested in, and maybe not the bit that could be most inspiring to people.
What's really important, I guess, about the conversation is there are definitely these things that I don't think were done really well. But actually, one of the things that I noticed, and you probably noticed about the people that we engaged with here, is the amount it engaged people in the space conversation. For me, there were so many people talking about the fact that, what do you mean you can get to space and back in 12 minutes? Where is the boundary of space that is made possible? Talking about the reusability aspect, many rockets today are developing in that kind of vein of becoming reusable, in the sense that, you launch in one piece and the rocket booster lands on itself. It may have been the first time that people have actually watched a rocket booster land, which is a feat in itself in terms of the technology and the development. So I think it opened up the door very much to talk about space. And that's what I loved about this story, is that I think it got space into a conversation where it normally might not have, but I think it could have done better.
Yeah, I think it's almost a question of, is any publicity good publicity?
Yeah, true.
You kind of brought the topic to the table. You just kind of got to hope that people leave with, maybe focusing on the most helpful bits, or taking things away from it that are positive. I think just for me, I think a lot of what I saw in the discourse was that it wasn't that inspiring, especially with it being a private company. We obviously don't know how much the individuals paid to go on, but the estimates are really high, not something that most people are familiar with, that amount of money. So I think it feels like a lot of people are like, why are we expected to be inspired by this? Is it something that's actually attainable for us? Is it something that's actually relatable for us? Yeah,
and it's something that we hope to discuss a little bit further in that section too, where we talk about the idea of space tourism and astronauts. But I mean, one of the things that we also hope that people take away from this is the idea that hopefully Katy Perry isn't the single figure that people remember as, hey, the first woman in space, because there have been plenty of women in space before this. I mentioned Valentina Tereshkova. We also had Sally Ride. Anyone that's not heard of Sally Ride, an American NASA astronaut who went into space back in the 1980s. And of course, our very own Helen Sharman, British astronaut. The first ever British astronaut was a female. So there's definitely, other female astronauts that I think should be in people's kind of conversations as well as these astronauts. But yeah, a publicity stunt that probably did what it was supposed to do and get people talking about space. But I think a missed opportunity when it comes to inspiring. It definitely engaged, but whether it inspired is a different question.
Absolutely. And a bit of the question of, is this the one that should have had all that publicity? What about all these other fantastic people that have been to space? be nice for them to have had like similar responses of excitement as well, or attention, I suppose I should say.
Yeah, I think, there have been many New Shepard flights. There have been, I think this was the 11th one, and I don't know that anyone's ever watched one of the previous ones. We may have heard of a few names, so Wally Funk was an astronaut that went up. William Shatner, people probably heard of him, but actually the number of other people that have been up, we probably don't know the names of.
Yeah. And if you have any questions about this mission or any other space-related questions, you can email us at podcast@spacecentre.co.uk. Okay, and we're going to move on to our second topic today. We're going to talk about space tourism, and specifically the debate around our space tourist astronauts. Do you want to give us a bit of a background to start our debate?
Yeah, so it's one that's definitely come up in the headlines more and more as we've seen lots more space tourists go into space. And actually this contention between, well, does someone who goes up on a 12-minute flight into space, cross the boundary of space and then come back down, actually count as an astronaut? And I guess it comes down to the fact of who you ask, because there is no set, like, internationally recognized definition of what it means to be an astronaut. So by the definition of Blue Origin or other companies like Virgin Galactic, who have also sent space tourists past the boundary of space and then come back down, they are astronauts. They have traveled into space and come back down. But according to organizations like NASA or the US military, their idea of traveling into space actually means that you have to conduct some procedure or some sort of operation that is crucial for that mission, in the sense that it's not autonomous, it's not automatic, for you to be considered an astronaut and have your astronaut wings. And, I kind of feel like this is, in a similar vein, the kind of debate that we might have between saying, well, if I get on a flight to America and I sat there as a passenger and did no kind of controlling of that, would I count myself as a pilot? Or am I a passenger and a tourist on a flight to a different country?
Yeah, I think there's no denying that a standard sort of space tourist flight is quite different from a mission, for example, that NASA sends up. I think the thing that I find interesting, you mentioned, NASA has this definition, which has actually been updated recently as well. So it's kind of a decision that's kind of been made by a group that we've kind of updated. So I guess my thought is this comparison actually super helpful? Does whether someone is called an astronaut or not an astronaut, is that actually the core of this debate? Or is it more, is space tourism useful? Is it helpful? Does it increase people's access to space?
I think one of the things to first break down is this idea of, I think the debate comes from the fact that there are very different almost routes to becoming an astronaut, either as a space tourist, as someone through a national space organization. So one of the things that people often talk about is the training to become an astronaut. Now, on a Blue Origin flight, at least on previous flights, it was 2 days of training. And it's not even 2 full days. It's just over a dozen hours. And they're essentially training to deal with the protocols and the procedures that they will experience on that space flight, and also in the case of an emergency. So within 2 days, you could become qualified to fly on an autonomous flight into space. Now, if we compare that with a NASA astronaut, for example, or even an ESA astronaut or other astronauts across the world, it can be a minimum of 2 years of training. And that training is, robust in the sense that it's not just about the physical things, about becoming aware of the equipment that you're using and becoming familiar with it. It's not just about emergency operations or procedures. It's about learning a different language so that you can communicate with some of the other astronauts and the languages that are used up in space. It's about learning the scientific techniques, because once you're up there, it's not just hey, I'm going to look out the window and see what's there. They're conducting proper science and investigations while they're up there. There's, the physical and mental aspects of, you're not on a 12-minute flight, you're on board a space station with, 6-7 other people for 6 months at a time in a confined space. How does our body deal with that, both mentally and physically, in the environment of space? So I think a lot of it comes down to the routes into that. And perhaps in terms of the routes, you might think about, well, which one might be more accessible?
Yeah, and I think as well, even if we look into the past, the routes have changed even prior to space tourism. If you go to really early human spaceflight missions, we're talking about people that almost pretty much exclusively had military backgrounds, and that's shifted towards then scientists, and then, you know, we have people like teachers and educators and things going up as well. So I think that landscape is kind of ever shifting anyway. But yeah, I think that question of which one of those actually means it's more accessible is the tricky question.
Yeah, I think, like you alluded to, I don't know whether it's so important about what we define as a space tourist or an astronaut. You know, you've gone up and you've come down, you've crossed the boundary of space. But actually what's being brought to our attention is this idea of, well, is this whole like space industry and the advancements in space making space more accessible for more people? And actually, thinking back to the private companies, Virgin Galactic, led by Richard Branson, you know, he talks about the ambitions of Virgin Galactic very much being about space tourism. When we look at Blue Origin, another private space company, they very much seem to be using space tourism as a stepping stone to improve accessibility into space for the benefit of looking after the Earth. I mean, Blue Origin is named after our blue planet, the Earth, right? So the focus is more on how can we benefit humanity. Space tourism is a stepping stone to that. And then we have other companies like SpaceX. And, you know, it's very clear that Elon Musk has talked about, you know, it's all about the technological advancement we can make for space and the long term, can we get humans to living on Mars? So they all have very different aims, but I think this accessibility to space is a very important part. And what we find right now, unfortunately, with this new kind of era of space, is that it's still a very new field, and therefore costs of those trips into space is very expensive. Even, you know, trips to the International Space Station made by private astronauts who are still doing work, tens of millions of pounds. Private space tourist flights for, you know, a dozen minutes, we're still talking, you know, millions. If not, it may have been bought under the threshold. We're still talking several $100,000. Not everyone can afford that.
No, absolutely not. And then I think, I mean, Josh and David touched on this before in one of our earlier episodes, that kind of idea of like, is it worth it? Does the cost, you know, kind of translate to a benefit? And there's lots of things to consider there, especially in terms of making it accessible. Do we want a future of space travel that is just lots of people being able to go on a little holiday, go on a quick flight, or do we want something more involved than that?
Yeah, space is developing into all these different things, right? You talked about like in-space manufacturing, that's something. Space tourism is another thing. But I think another one of those key questions we have to consider is actually, is space tourism even a sustainable thing in the long term? You know, there are benefits in the sense that I think anyone, and hopefully anyone, who travels into space and sees our planet from space, looking back, may have just a changed view and a changed perspective of our planet, and then use that as a force of doing better to help life on our planet and help the troubles and the problems we've caused on our planet. But actually, we've also got to think about, well, there are benefits of going into space, and we've talked about this in a previous podcast episode, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in the future as well. But one thing that does come up is this idea of, well, we're just sending people on massive polluting rockets up into space to come back down. You know, what's the benefit of that? And I think the idea is, well, we've got to weigh up the benefits versus the costs. When we first had commercial flights, you know, the same thing is there. They're polluting. We still use flights now, but there is a benefit of actually getting humans to cross the world for various different ventures, for various different reasons, and many of them being beneficial. So can we weigh the same thing up with the space tourist industry?
Yeah, it's really tricky. And you've talked about sustainability, which I think is, you know, always an important question. And I've been very lucky. I've met a couple of astronauts, and all of them say, you know, looking back at the planet is, you know, what a way to realise, you know, we are all one, and that we really need to look after our planet. You know, that's kind of the whole kind of idea of looking back and reflecting and kind of improving humanity. I think that environmental cost is really important. I think also something that comes up a lot as a topic is like space debris as well, which again is kind of factors in as well. Like, is it worth putting this debris up to send some people into space? I think it's something that we're going to have to keep seeing, really. And I think for me, it's baking in, you know, why do we want to do this? Why do we want to make space more accessible for people? what would be your thoughts? What do you reckon it brings to people?
To wrap things up, I feel like people look at the private space industry and almost have like oh no, this is the bad. We don't really like it. There's too many things that we see as problems. But actually, what we've seen is that the private space industry is really pushing development of space technology. Reusable rockets have become almost the norm in a lot of space companies because they're pushing for these new technologies. And that reusability aspect is beneficial for the environment rather than sending, the 1K Saturn V that would never be able to be used again. And actually, one of the things that I think Josh mentioned on the previous podcast as well is this idea of looking at reusable fuels, so alternative fuels, biofuels, that actually the amount of carbon released from using this biofuel is the same or equivalent of the carbon that was captured when we grew that crop to make the fuel in the first place. So I think the private space industry can push for these environmental changes as long as the technology is driven in that direction. But that's the kind of balance that we need to work out.
Yeah, making sure to keep those goals in sight. No technology is perfect when it starts off. It's about refining it and making sure it goes in that direction of providing more benefit than it does harm. So
couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So every episode we'd like to give you a chance to engage in some space related things yourself. Have you got anything for us for today, Dhara?
Yes, so if the weather is playing ball and you can get yourself outside, we have our Stargazing Challenges blog, which you can try for yourself at home. So a few challenges throughout the month of June to get your hands stuck into. So you can look out for something called the plough, which is a very famous asterism. And if you're feeling confident, you can have a look for some star trails and see if you can capture them. But one of the things that I also like to do is catch the moon beside different objects. And on the 1st of June, you can see the moon beside Mars, but if you wait till the 11th, you'll see the moon beside another very bright red dot in the sky, but it won't be Mars, it will be the star Antares, which actually translates to meaning the rival of Mars. So you might want to have a go at those. Now, if it's not playing ball outside, what could people possibly do to get involved in space from the inside?
Well, if you fancy looking at some fantastic pictures from the Webb telescope, you could take part in a citizen science project. There is one called Cosmic Collisions, and this looks at black holes, or helps collect some data about black holes. By looking at pictures of galaxies colliding together, you can help collect some real data for some scientists and their research. And that brings us to the end of our episode today. Thank you, Dhara.
Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you very much for listening and joining us. We'll be back next Friday to go beyond the headlines. Make sure you subscribe to the Space Now podcast on whatever podcast app you use so you don't miss an episode.
And we want to know what you want to know. So do get in touch with us at podcast@spacecentre.co.uk with your questions and requests. See you soon.